Welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. It's a pleasure to welcome you for today's environmental conversation. This is the seminar series for people who have had more than a lifetime's worth of seminars, and it's a chance to go a little deeper into who the people are, what motivates them, and why they've chosen the path they have, what each of us can do in order to learn from and potentially pursue some of the same things. Before I introduce Fran, I want to start out with a little ad for our next session. Will be on May 31st, and the environmental conversation will be with Marcia McNutt, who's the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Today, it's a special pleasure to introduce Fran Ulmer. Fran is the Cox Visiting Professor in the School of Earth Sciences and the chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, as that second title implies. Her passion is really about the Arctic, and you'll have a chance to hear about that today. Fran's had a long and distinguished career, starting in Wisconsin, but from, I think, the 1970s, being based in Alaska. She was for 18 years an elected official, going from being the mayor of Juneau to being the first woman elected to statewide office in Alaska as lieutenant governor from 1994 to 2002. She then transitioned to the university, where she was a professor and then chancellor of the University of Alaska at Anchorage from, I think, 2007 to 2011. In 2011, she was appointed chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission by President Obama. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission really says, what should we be doing up there where there's all that ice and those people and those important things happening? And she was named special advisor to John Kerry on Arctic issues in 2014. Fran has been really unusual as a visiting professor here, because rather than hole up in an office and pursue her own agenda, she's really shaken things up. She has been very vocal about our opportunities and, in fact, our responsibilities for the Arctic. And she has, much more than any other visiting faculty member I've ever encountered, really tried to drive an agenda that's opened our eyes and changed the university. So join me in welcoming Fran Ulmer.
Thank you, Chris.
Fran, let me start with a question about what took you to the Arctic and what took you to Alaska in the 1970s.
I graduated from the University of Wisconsin Law School, not really being certain what it was that I wanted to do with my law degree. Pretty sure that I wanted to do something in the policy area, but I really didn't know what. So I took the first job that I was offered, which was working for the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. Antitrust litigation, Bureau of Competition, really boring. And it's a good thing to do, to take a job and kind of force yourself to do something that's kind of hard and sort of outside of what it was you thought you'd be doing. But I knew for sure after a year that it really wasn't what I wanted to do for my lifetime. And so I did something rather impulsive and took a job in Juneau, Alaska, working for the Alaska legislature. For those of you who are still pretty young in this audience, I would say there's a lot to be said for taking a risk when you're pretty sure you want to do something other than what you're doing right now. And that's pretty much what I did. I thought a year in Juneau, Alaska as a drafting attorney for the Alaska legislature might be pretty interesting, and it was. And I found myself in the middle of a whole lot of issues that, because Alaska was still a pretty young state, needed to be defined. There were a lot of open questions about policy, about taxation, about education, about healthcare. So I sort of felt like I'd died and gone to heaven. There were just so many issues. It was a wide array of things and really interesting people. Not to mention great fishing, great hiking, great kayaking, great cross-country skiing, all of which I had grown up doing in Wisconsin and dearly loved. So it kind of led to the rest of my life, I guess is what you'd have to say, and it was a pretty good decision.
And maybe you could say a couple things about your turn into electoral politics, because most of us have not had that experience, and you moved through many different positions and to the highest levels in the state.
Well, I'd have to admit that I was always interested in government in one way or another. I mean, my undergraduate degree was political science and economics, and went to law school. When I was in high school, I was active in student government and debate and all of those things that sort of tell you that you aren't afraid to stand up and say something bold, even if it's wrong. And so I guess in a way, fairly early in life, I had taken on the idea that it's okay to try to make a difference, even if you are kind of young. So when I was 36, I ran for mayor of Juneau, and I won. I ran for mayor of that particular office because I looked at the cast of characters who were running for mayor, and I said to myself, I don't think they are in tune with what's going on in this community. I don't see them with a vision for this community. Juneau's the capital city, that was consistent with either what I thought was necessary, or perhaps more importantly, what I knew people in Juneau cared about. Why could I say that? I had been serving on the Planning and Zoning Commission. I had been appointed to that by the mayor, and I had been asked if I would lead the process for Juneau's revision of its comprehensive plan. Has anybody in this room ever participated in a comprehensive plan rewrite? There are a few of you. So one of the first things you do is you go out and you hold community meetings. You have little neighborhood meetings, and you find out where people want a new stop sign, or where they need a little pocket park for kids to play in, or whatever. I had done like a couple dozen of those community meetings in the process of revising the comprehensive plan. So I had a pretty good idea of what people wanted by way of the next direction for the city. So I ran on that, and I won, and surprised everyone, sort of myself too. And that turned out to be one of those experiences that I guess you could say I wasn't really prepared for. I'm not sure anybody's ever 100% prepared for the office that they run for and get, because there are always surprises about that once you're there. But I was better prepared than I think a lot of people, because of what had already happened in my life, and I enjoyed it immensely. Local government is where the rubber really meets the road. It's where communities really can make things happen, and it's where people engage in a way that's very meaningful. So you have to be prepared for the fact that, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're going to get a phone call from somebody who is really irritated that the garbage truck started too early that day. And my kids were actually pretty young when I was mayor. They refused to go to the grocery store with me because they knew I would be stopped, and talked to. So we made a deal. Nobody had to go grocery shopping with Mama.
I'm going to get off electoral politics in a minute here, but I think we're in a moment in the United States where more and more people are considering entering electoral politics, even though that's not necessarily the background. I wonder if you have thoughts about that as a moment in history, and advice for people out here who are aspiring politicians.
You know, my experience was at a very different time. You know, I was in elected office for 18 years as a mayor, as a legislator, and as lieutenant governor in a state where, you know, people really got to know each other, and there was a much more of a sort of a personal sense of investing, both from the standpoint of the issues that people care about and whether or not they're willing to volunteer for you. And you know, it's kind of hard to transition from that kind of an experience to California or to a national office. But some things remain true, I think, everywhere. And that is, people want an authentic candidate. They want to vote for, work for, volunteer for, contribute to someone who really has a vision of what they're trying to accomplish, not just, I want to be somebody, so I'm running for office. They want to have the sense that you are running for office because you believe in something and you're willing to work for that something. And that you have the kind of experience necessary to do that something. Now, admittedly, there are a lot of people who get elected that maybe don't fit that vision, that description, but I think that's still what voters want. So for people who are thinking about running for office, and I hope some of you are, I would ask first these questions. Am I ready? Have I done the kind of preparation that at least positions me on the issues that are most important for this particular position for this particular time? Is my family, my significant other, who else is sort of in your inside circle, ready to take on that challenge with you? Because it is kind of a group thing. I mean, you're the one who's running, but particularly if you're married or have kids or have a partner, they're going to be doing that journey with you, so they better be ready. And I would ask myself whether I was willing to take on the criticism and the unfairness of a campaign. And I would say, in comparison to when I ran and served, the unfairness level has gone way up in terms of the edge to the political dialogue and the way in which the 24-hour media cycle and social media makes it possible now to get away with a lot of not only unfairness and rudeness, but also just plain lies, let's call it for what it is. So it's harder now, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it or think about doing it. It just means that you really have to do a few things in your life to toughen your skin so that you're ready for it. And I don't want to overstate that, but I also don't want to understate it. There are things that you can do and experiment with to see whether or not you're really up to that challenge. And one of the things I always recommend to young people who come to me and say, I'm thinking maybe I'll run for office someday. What should I, how should I think about that? I would say a couple of things. Volunteer for somebody else's campaign and get some experience with what that campaign process actually is like. Work in an office, making phone calls, sticking envelopes, whatever, but get some sense on the inside of a campaign so that you can sort of get the feel for the rhythm, the choices that have to be made, the pace, and watch up close what a candidate has to go through. I would say, by all means, do that first. Secondly, position yourself so that you have credibility in the space. So let's suppose that you want to run for the school board. I would say volunteer for one of the many advisory committees that school board probably has. Work in the schools, work through PTA, work in a way that establishes that you've already, I won't say paid your dues because that's a very old-fashioned concept, but at least become familiar enough with how decisions get made, what the issues are, give people a sense of who you are, and that will establish some credibility in that space. So I could go on for hours on this topic. I'll just stop there and say, I think recent elections have demonstrated that it really matters to get good people to not only run, but also to get good people to work for candidates who are running that you can believe in. It's important to register to vote. It's important to vote. It's important to support candidates by writing checks. But it's also incredibly important for good people to run and for good people to actively support those people who are running. We can't take this democracy for granted anymore.
Thank you, yeah. And anyone who is interested in elected office can consult the Fran Ulmer Consulting Service for the rest of the time that she's
free of charge.
Well, let me move from elective politics to what's been your passion for the last several years, and you really made a transition from politics and administration to mostly science. And you want to speak to that? I mean, why science?
Well, obviously, I didn't choose science when I was going to college, did I? So how did I get from there and a law degree to now spending an awfully lot of time in the science world? To answer that, maybe I should tell you a story. When I was first elected to the legislature, I was 40 years old, and I remember the first couple of months, I was very much in the, I've got to learn everything, and you study and you talk to people, etc. One day, a group of fishermen, commercial fishermen, came to my office and announced that they were there to educate me about the commercial fishing industry. They wanted to explain to me the difference between a gill netter, a seiner, a troller, a longliner. They wanted to explain to me how the management system worked, state management, federal management of waters. They wanted me to understand why it was important for me to be able to articulate support for funding the Department of Fish and Game so that the fish biologists could do aerial surveys and stream counts and the other kinds of things to get some sense for what the salmon abundance was and how they could set limits. And I mean, all of this, even though I had lived in Juneau for a while by this time, I mean, I knew there was a commercial fishing industry. I knew it was important to the community. I knew it created jobs, and I knew that Alaska had a great reputation as being a sustainably managed fishery. But I didn't know a lot of the things that they told me. So the second time they came to visit me, they brought along a fisheries biologist from the University of Alaska. His name was Ole Mathieson. I still remember Ole Mathieson. He was sort of an old and grizzled guy that ordinarily I probably would not have been visited by, but the fishermen brought him to explain to me how the fisheries biologists did the job that they did to support the management, which supported the commercial fishermen being able to fish the way they did. They tied it all together for me. The science and the research, the management, the policy, the legislation, how that rolled out in terms of who got to fish when, how that affected the economics of the region, the community. I mean, I became an advocate for the commercial fishing budget and, the science that supported it, but I also became kind of, one of those people in the legislature that got recognized as a fish expert because I had been educated. And it kind of turned me on to this whole relationship between science and policy, between management in a way that sustains not only the salmon and the economy, but also how important it was for people in elected office to support that whole system. So I started a fisheries caucus, and anyway, honestly, my connection to science today in the Arctic space goes all the way back to that. And it reminds me, again, in part at least, why I'm so happy to have the opportunity to hang out with scientists here, because as I talk to a lot of the people at Stanford, whether they are faculty, staff, or students, people here want to be relevant. They want their work to have meaning. The only way that happens is if you break outside of your comfort zone and communicate with people like elected officials. So, adopt a mayor. Take a legislator to lunch. See it as part of what it is you're doing in the science world to talk to non-scientists. And for those of us who are the non-scientists, we're kind of like translators. And that's really what I do right now between the science community in the Arctic space and policymakers and, to a certain extent, the general public, trying to connect those dots for people so that they can see the relevance and the importance of investing in science and research to the things that really matter in life, the decisions that get made, whether it's how to regulate a salmon fishery or how we can manage climate change. So it goes all that way back, but since then there have been many others who along the way, like you and others in this room, have helped me deepen my connectivity to the science community and my ability to translate.
Yeah, let me follow up a little bit on your adopt a mayor or take a legislator to lunch concept, because I think you're 100% right that many of the people in our community are keenly interested in being of use to the policy process, but that adopt a mayor doesn't quite have enough detail so that people know exactly what that really means. And what do you think is the right way to begin reaching out to establish these kind of dialogues that eventually are going to mean that the people in the decision-making posts have the information that they need?
Well, of course, there's no one path. There are many paths, but I'll just tell you for sure, most people in elected office do not read journal articles.
What?
I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you might be able to find a few, and actually I could probably name a few, but I won't do that. But you know, there are a few who are kind of in the wonky space who would take the time to do that. But it's more likely that if you prepared a one-pager, a summary of what it was in your research that you thought was particularly relevant to this particular elected official because of his or her constituency, the community they live in, or the state they live in, or the business group that they're particularly interested in, whether it's farmers or ranchers or whomever, if you could put it down to one page and send it to them, or even better, go visit their office, that would be a beginning of a dialogue that might be perceived by that elected official as, you're useful to me. You have useful information. You have something relevant to a space that I care about. As in my example with the salmon fishermen who came to my office. I didn't ask them to come. They asked to talk to me, and they educated me. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. One way is making your information and what it is you know relevant to them. One way is, you know, a public hearing. One way is getting to know a staff member, because you can't always meet up with the principal, but it's often a staff person in an elected official's office that they turn to and trust for that information that they need for a vote that's coming up or a speech they need to make. So there's no one path, but I would say it's not that hard to figure out. It's not that hard to figure out if you realize that what you have is something that's useful. You just have to present it in a way that makes it timely, relevant, digestible, understandable in English, in a way that makes it quite clear that you have utility. And then you can develop that relationship, which over time builds trust, and that trusting relationship over time will open up more doors for you in terms of your ability to have a meaningful contribution in a policy sense.
And the one thing I hear consistently is that the investment in developing the relationship and being patient, that it's not going to be a one-time intervention or even a 5-time intervention before you've got things, so that
Absolutely.
The relationship has sufficient trust.
Absolutely.
Well, let's transition to talking about the Arctic now. And as you well know, the Arctic is the part of the world that's seen the most profound warming. Speak for just a couple of minutes about the way you see climate change in the Arctic and the issues that brings into focus.
So there are many ways in which I think I could answer that question, but let me answer it from the standpoint of, okay, we're sitting here in California. It's a long way from California to the Arctic, so why should you care? It's actually, I checked today, it's exactly 3,000 miles from Palo Alto to Anchorage, and it's 3,000 miles from Palo Alto to Miami. So just to kind of, you know, you're a long way from Miami, you're a long way from Anchorage. So, you know, do you think of the Arctic as cold, dark, and far away? It is snowing in Anchorage today. So it seems like a very, you know, like out of my reality space sitting here in California. So why should you care? So I guess let me start with, I'll give you 3 reasons. There are many more, but I'll give you 3 reasons why you should be interested in and care about how fast the Arctic is changing. Number 1, the Arctic acts kind of like an air conditioner for the planet. It helps keep the planet cool. One of the ways in which it does that is when When the Arctic is the way it should be, white, with a lot of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean and a lot of snow on land, and it's white, it's reflecting back into space a lot of that energy from the sun. And if it's not white, if we've lost a lot of sea ice, and we've lost about 50% of the sea ice in the summer sea ice minimums, instead that dark ocean is absorbing energy, which warms the ocean, which melts more ice, which warms the planet. So less ice, less snow, a darker Arctic instead of a whiter Arctic is not only warming the Arctic, it's contributing 1/3 to 1/2 of the global temperature rise. So you should care about the Arctic and the fact that it's getting warmer and losing ice, because it's sort of like your air conditioner at home kind of losing its power, losing its juice. That's one reason why you should really care about the fact that the Arctic is changing this fast, because global temperatures matter. Number 2, ice. I've been talking about sea ice. Let's talk about ice sheets. Let's talk about glacier ice. We know that Greenland is losing mass. What happens to it? To the extent that it contributes to sea level rise, that matters to you a whole lot. As you know, San Francisco's got a small problem. It's got a combined subsidence and sea level rise that makes the San Francisco area more vulnerable than some other places over time to sea level rise. So the fact that Greenland is now contributing more to sea level rise than Antarctica is, and the sea ice, not sea ice, but glacier ice and the ice sheet loss is increasing, not decreasing. It's now contributing more than Antarctica does to sea level rise. That's another reason to be concerned about the Arctic's rapid change and warming. And the third one I will give you is the extent to which a warmer Arctic is contributing to global weather changes that will continue to profoundly affect all of us, regardless of where we live. So let me just suggest to you this month's Scientific American. There's an article by Jennifer Francis, who is an atmospheric scientist at Rutgers University. Jennifer Francis has been writing a number of articles, journal articles as well as other articles, on this topic of how a warmer Arctic is destabilizing the jet stream. So in very simplistic terms, the jet stream used to look more like a donut, relatively stable. It now looks increasingly more like a snake. What does that mean when the cold air is not being kept neatly in the upper latitudes and the warmer mid-latitudes? When you get the snake effect, you know, you hear the weathermen talk about polar vortex, etc. It means longer periods of cold where, you know, it shouldn't be quite as cold, warm where it shouldn't be quite as warm. It means longer periods of rain, longer periods of drought, unusual weather patterns. Now, there's still evolving science in trying to understand exactly the extent to which this warmer Arctic phenomenon is contributing to this less predictable and erratic jet stream phenomenon that is affecting weather worldwide. But as time goes by, it's becoming clearer and clearer that a warm Arctic has a lot of really negative consequences for people regardless of where they live. So why should you care? I'll just sum it up by saying this. We think of polar bears and walrus and ring seals as being ice-dependent species. I just want you to walk out of here this afternoon realizing that you and I are part of an ice-dependent species. Humans are ice-dependent. We need to keep a certain amount of ice on this planet, in the Arctic as well as in the Antarctic, or we are in, this is a scientific term, deep doo-doo. I'll stop there.
Well, I said I was going to transition to science, but actually maybe we could go back to public opinion a little bit and you know, the warming has been profound across the Arctic, and especially in Alaska. And I wonder, even though Alaska isn't, you know, famous for progressive politics, how people perceive their personal experience with the fact that the climate has changed so dramatically, and how that fits into a narrative, and whether there are lessons from Alaska that we should be thinking about applying more broadly.
I think there are lessons from California that the U.S. should be adopting more broadly, personally, in many ways. But to answer your question, how do people in Alaska perceive climate change? It's so in your face in Alaska, you can't escape it. You know, for a number of years where the famous dog sled race, you know, the Iditarod, when there hasn't been enough snow in Anchorage or in Wasilla and you have to move the start of the Iditarod to Fairbanks, you know, when ice cellars in northern Alaska where the Inupiat and the Yupik store their food start thawing and their food rots, when you get breakup on the big major rivers of the north that are usually used as ice roads and cars fall through the water and people die. I mean, you can't escape the fact that the weather, the climate, the temperature, the patterns, the ice, the lifestyle is changing so dramatically and so quickly in places like Alaska. You can't say it's not happening. So for some people, the deniers can say, well, it's, you know, it happens. It'll get cold again. You know, there are some people who say that. And then there are other people who say, well, yeah, it's happening, but it's not our fault. Not humans, right? You know, there's always that. And then there's the growing body of, well, yeah, it is happening, and yeah, it's really changing things a lot, and maybe we are partially to blame, but we're still going to keep drilling oil and gas up here because it's not really our fault that the consumers worldwide want our petroleum. We have to change the demand. It's not, I mean, if we don't drill it in Alaska, they'll drill it off the coast of Nigeria or in Norway or someplace else, right? So that enables Alaskans to kind of live with these dualities of, yes, we are an oil state. It is 1/3 of our economy, and we're not dialing back the importance of that piece of our economy. But what we really need to do is transition the world to renewables, to alternative fuels, to changing our lifestyles, to eating less beef, to just a whole lot of other things, that we can't solve that problem just by not drilling oil in Alaska. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say that Alaskans, probably like most people everywhere, live with a certain amount of, well, yes, I know what I should do, but there's a limit to what I will do until somebody else does something differently, right? So that's kind of the attitude. Now, in terms of the movement in Alaska toward renewables, putting up wind turbines in rural villages so that they don't have to rely on diesel anymore, we're certainly doing that. And in terms of trying to find alternative ways to reduce some of the easy things, like making our buildings more energy efficient, we're certainly doing that. But I would say that the 750,000 people who live in Alaska, we don't even have 1 million people who live in Alaska, really tend to see it more as what people in the mid-latitudes are choosing to do and how they're living their lives than it is what we are doing, because we have such a small carbon footprint in terms of how the choices that we make actually affect global weather, global climate, global choices about the economy. So that's why when I started, I said, I really think more states need to follow California's lead, and the U.S. certainly need to, I think, follow the lead of other progressive countries in the world that are really making a commitment, not just to Paris, but to beyond Paris, to completely move toward zero carbon economies. That's frankly the only way we're going to save the ice.
And I wonder if you want to say a few things about how Alaskans see the challenge of adapting to the climate changes that have already occurred or that are baked into the system, because there have been such profound changes, all the way from moving the start of the Iditarod to changing the way that you get to oil and gas drilling places because you can't use the ice roads anymore.
Mm-hmm. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers identified about 30 villages in Alaska that will have to be moved because of a combination of climate change, thawing permafrost, and increased coastal erosion. And there are several of the communities that are already in the process of moving, Nutak, Shishmaref, Kivalina, because they've lost so much of their infrastructure. And basically, they worry that the next really big fall storm that comes along, not only may they lose more infrastructure, more roads, more schools, more houses, but also lives. So the transition to a different place to locate these villages is part of the adaptation process underway. It's tricky because, you know, there isn't like a federal fund to move climate refugees. Having said that, I mean, there is actually one community in Louisiana that received money to move, and Nutak, one of the villages in Alaska, just received, I think, $13 million to help with the moving process. But these are very small steps in comparison to the size of the challenge, not just for these particular communities in Alaska, but frankly, for many other places in the world and in the United States that we will have to face at some point as we see more and more the need to transition to a new way of thinking about what places can we live in, given coastal erosion, given thawing permafrost, given sea level rise, given increased storm damage. So part of the adaptation scenario in Alaska is trying to help communities figure out their move strategy. It's also changing the way in which we build buildings. So about 10 days ago, I was in Anchorage and I met with representatives from 2 large engineering firms in Anchorage that are in the process of trying to change the ecological atlas on which engineers rely when they try to do an assessment and do the planning as to how they will build buildings for the next 30 years. So guess what? Even today, we know that today, if you're building a building, you can't rely on information that was put together 20 years ago. And you certainly can't rely on information even that's being accumulated today, knowing that 20 years from now, you will need entirely different engineering designs if you're working in permafrost, if you're working in unstable conditions, if you're working in areas that are susceptible to coastal erosion. So how does the planning, engineering, design, and construction industry make the shift to planning, designing, and building buildings, roads, airports, etc., in a world where you know 20 years from now it's going to look entirely different than the information we have today? So this is an interesting problem of where scientific research, engineers, and the people who are in the private sector doing the work have to find new ways to communicate and model and project in ways that, frankly, we didn't have to do 50 years ago, or at least in most places we didn't. So we're in this dialogue about this adaptation world that we have to be in. You know, we have this big pipeline that runs from Prudhoe Bay, which is where the oil and gas is, all the way down to Valdez to the terminal. The line, of course, part of it is on permafrost, has over the years had, we've used different technologies as the permafrost has been thawing to change how the refrigeration of the support infrastructure under the pipeline has worked. That's worked pretty well, and there's been adaptation along the way. But there's this huge debris flow that is coming down a gigantic mountainside headed toward the pipeline right now. Nobody has any idea how to stop that debris flow. It's going pretty slowly, you know, like a foot a year, but it may start moving faster, and it's going to hit the road before it hits the pipeline. But I mean, what do you do when a whole mountain sort of starts to slough off toward the major piece of infrastructure that keeps oil and gas flowing and, oh, by the way, revenues to the state of Alaska. It's a big problem. So, we're working at some of the issues associated with adaptation, but there are a lot of really big issues headed our way that we are not prepared for.
And in the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, one of your mandates is to think hard about what are the big unanswered scientific questions. Do they include these things like how to forge new partnerships between the scientific, engineering, and public communities?
Yes. One of the reasons I was talking to the engineers 10 days ago was because the U.S. Arctic Research Commission is going to host a workshop later this summer, bringing together key players like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the military, big construction firms, the engineering community, the folks at the University, not only of Alaska, but at other universities where they are doing work in permafrost, projections, modeling, and also materials investigations. We're doing a workshop on exactly this topic because, back to my earlier statement about trying to bring people from different perspectives together in a format where they can hear each other, understand each other, and work together. That is the kind of thing that I think we need to do more of, particularly when you've got people's attention. When you see the problem and can define the problem, and people realize that they need to rise to the occasion, that's when you can really get people's attention, right? And so that's why we've decided on that workshop as a priority for the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. And I should just mention before people start to leave, because I know we're kind of running out of time, in the back of the room, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission does this goals report, which kind of identifies the big picture needs in Arctic research. There's an easy version that you can take with you. I didn't bring enough copies of it. You can take that with you. Or you can go to arctic.gov. Arctic.gov is the website for the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, where you can get information, that and a whole bunch of other things that may be useful to you. If I have in some way today made you just slightly more curious, which is what I hope I have done, go to arctic.gov. And you can also sign up for a daily electronic newsletter that gives you a little snapshot on everything that's going on in the Arctic from the standpoint of interesting science that has been done, upcoming meetings, political pronouncements by elected officials of people of the North. Anyway, arctic.gov.
I hope nobody is leaving, because we're about to get to the good part. One of the real goals of these conversations is it's a chance for each of you to be involved, and it's not really about me asking questions. So I'm going to ask one more question, but it's time for each of you to think about the things that you really wanted to ask Fran. And the last thing I want to ask is about the changing international nature of the Arctic. There's a whole new ocean that we need to think about in terms of multiple nations being engaged in. There are whole new transportation corridors that are potentially available, and a whole series of mineral exploration issues that might be coming into focus. And I wonder how you think about the juxtaposition between the science components of all those things and the national priorities, the national security components, and sort of what are the aspects of the opening Arctic Ocean especially that keep you up at night?
Well, that's an hour-long lecture. So the Arctic Ocean has been covered by ice largely, so most people don't go there, haven't gone there. Researchers have gone there. Explorers occasionally have gone there. More and more tourists are kind of going there to places like Svalbard and Greenland, and et cetera. But you're right, generally speaking, the hope that is being articulated, particularly in the 8 Arctic nations, but others as well, is, oh gee, it's a new ocean. That means economic development, shipping, oil and gas, tourism, fishing, mining, opportunity that didn't exist. It was under ice. Now we can get there. It's about access. And I might also note the possibility of military engagement and a whole lot of national security issues, which is a whole nother lecture. But let's just say that the opening of the ocean is most likely to be of interest to countries that could benefit from it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So Russia is a big chunk of the Arctic. If you just hold the globe right, and I encourage you all occasionally to actually hold the globe, I mean, it gives you a whole different view of...
The earth in your hands is a good analogy.
Yeah. So if you hold a globe, you will see that a very large portion of the Arctic is Russian territory. And it happens to be where Russia has about 80% of its oil and gas resources. So not surprisingly, Russia is really interested in not just oil and gas development in the Arctic, but increasing shipping along its northern route. We call it the Northern Sea Route, because it's a way potentially of getting their oil and gas to market. They already have ice-strengthened LNG tankers that are taking Yamal natural gas to market. But Russia has also actively promoted the Northern Sea Route as an alternative to the Suez Canal. Why? Because going from Europe to Asia over the Northern Sea Route is 4,000 miles shorter than going south through the Suez Canal. So the pitch to the shipping industry is it's shorter, less time, less money, connect Europe, connect Asia. On the one hand, that is true. On the other hand, it's not ice-free year-round. It's ice-free for longer periods of time, and it's true even in winter that ice is young ice as opposed to really multi-year harder ice, so it's easier to get through, but it's still cold, dark, and dangerous, all right, in the wintertime. And there isn't a lot of infrastructure. Russia is building more infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route for their own purposes as well as for shipping, but there's still a lot of that route that doesn't quite meet the test of what you'd really like to have a safe shipping route in terms of infrastructure, in terms of navigation aids, in terms of charting. There's inadequate charting in the Arctic. So on the one hand, it is shorter, and yes, it may very well appeal not just to Russia, but to Asia, to be able to get natural resources out of Russia to Asia as a shipping route. Singapore, Korea, et cetera, all the countries that are shipping nations like the idea of alternative routes. And so on the one hand, that may happen. On the other hand, it's still dark, cold, dangerous, stormy, icy for large portions of the year. And oh, by the way, it has to go through choke points like the Bering Strait, that little narrow piece of water between Russia and Alaska. So what keeps me up at night? Your question. As an Alaskan, what keeps me up at night is increased shipping through the Bering Strait without ports of refuge, a deep water port on the US side, we don't have one, inadequate icebreaking and response vessels on the US side. We've got 2 aging icebreakers. Russia has 40. And so what keeps me up at night, we are not ready, we the US, or I would argue we the world, to really accommodate the increased activity that may come as a result of the increased access, whether it's shipping, oil and gas, or anything else. We don't yet have what I would describe as the safety net or the preparation necessary to really make that space a lower risk operation for whatever kind of human activity we might evolve in that space. So, there's that old saying, you can't stop progress. Progress is in the eye of the beholder, just like beauty. But let me just say, to the extent that access is increasing, interest is increasing, maybe investment will be increasing, we as a nation have a lot of work to do to really be prepared for what may lie ahead.
And I promise that you guys can go, but let me just follow up real quickly on that. And you mentioned that Russia has dramatically more icebreakers. Would you say that overall Russia has really been preparing for capitalizing on this exploitation of the Arctic in a way that the U.S. hasn't? And does that in particular raise new conservation challenges?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Now we're open for questions. And I think there are microphones, if you can wait for a microphone to come. And Fran, if you want to call on questioners, that'd be great.
Hi, Jim.
So I want to give you another chunk of that hour lecture. So especially in this moment when the U.S. is not likely to lead on these issues, and when Russia also is challenging, what are the most promising avenues? Stick with shipping, just as a good example. I mean, what do you see as the most promising avenues for advancing better management of the threats that are headed our way?
So I did not ask him to ask that question. International Arctic science cooperation is a safe space. I mean, you know, the United States has used science diplomacy in many different venues for a very long time. Because, as it turns out, most countries are really interested in having better answers to big questions and being able to make better investments to prepare for what is either in the private sector or the public sector. And that has certainly been true in the Arctic. So even though our relationship with Russia is a little rocky right now, and I don't know, since we've, you know, jettisoned a number of people who actually were in DC working on Arctic science on behalf of Russia, I don't know exactly how that's going to turn out in the next couple of weeks, but it's been remarkably good, that relationship. The Arctic relationship among the Arctic 8, thanks to the Arctic Council, which has existed for over 20 years, thanks to things like the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, which was held in 2016, where 25 countries of the world sent their science ministers to focus on improving the kind of collaboration in the Arctic science space. And by the way, another one is going to be held in Berlin in October this year. So that is promising, building on that international collaboration, because the Arctic is an international space. Nobody owns it, really. You know, it's a place where what happens with your next-door neighbor really matters. I mean, the borders are pretty tight up there, and the Arctic Ocean is really, you can't say it's our space, it's everybody's space. So that's one really bright spot. And I'll offer a second one before the next question, and that's in the fisheries arena. You know, when the 5 Arctic coastal states agreed a few years ago that there would be a moratorium on commercial fishing in the central Arctic Ocean, that was sort of a surprise that the countries would say, we're not going there because we don't know enough about what is in the central Arctic Ocean to conduct a sustainable fisheries management regime. And then the full Arctic 8 agreed, and now 12 nations of the world are in the final stages of actually inking an agreement, by the way, including China, that they will not fish in the central Arctic Ocean, but instead will conduct an Arctic science collaboration to do more work so that someday, who knows, maybe it would make sense, but not today. That is, you know, the precautionary principle writ large. You hardly ever see that these days. But you see it in the central Arctic Ocean, moratorium on fisheries, 12 of the major fishing, the Arctic 8 plus others. So there is good news here, and I think, you know, fortunately, at least so far, the Arctic has been a place that has been not the kind of conflict that we have seen in other places. May it continue to be that. And to the extent that the science community can help support those bridges in the international science collaboration space, I think that's a very good thing. Sure, fine.
So yeah, following up on that, much like your description of the infrastructure for shipping, people who do science in the Arctic, especially on ice sheets, a lot of it is dependent on infrastructure, either stations or airplanes or things that are very tied to national programs. So if we want to follow up on your advice to pursue international science collaborations, in a practical sense, is that then don't go through your NSF Polar Program Officer and instead go through some like competing international process, or in a practical way, how would that play out?
So again, there are several routes to the goal. NSF has, these new initiatives, one of which is in the Arctic space, and they have encouraged. I think the deadline is like the end of May, if I'm not mistaken. I've forgotten exactly, but they've encouraged new submissions for ways in which not only interdisciplinary but international work can be done. So it's not only NSF, but it is NSF because Franz Cordova, the head of NSF, has really kind of bought into this vision that if we really want to advance our state of understanding of the Arctic, we have to do it across disciplines and across boundaries, and so that's the good news. But there are other things as well. So Germany, for example, the Alfred Wegener Institute initiated this Mosaic project, and that's also an international opportunity. They have more EU funding than there is NSF funding right now, but because NSF just got a bump in its budget above what the president had asked for, NSF is in the process right now of trying to decide how they might allocate some of that additional money. And I have inside information that they're thinking about more Mosaic funding. So there are a couple of different ways in which you can approach that. But I would, back to the relationship point that we were talking about earlier in the political space, the relationship space in the science is also really important. So building up relationships with your colleagues in Germany and in Norway and in Sweden and with other countries where they have prioritized not only Arctic investment, but can have access to the EU 2020, Horizons 2020 money, basically wants international participants, right? So you may have to get through that door with one of your European colleagues, as opposed to going after that money individually. But there are ways to get there from here. I don't know what our timing is.
We have another half an hour.
Okay, all right, great. More questions, Ed? Go.
I have a question about Alaska as a state and its future. So Alaska has kind of been on a roller coaster ride for the last couple hundred years. Gold rush, fishery booms, fishery die-offs, the oil boom, more fishery booms. Now Alaska fisheries are under more stress, there's more uncertainty, and we're moving hopefully away from oil and gas, which you mentioned is 30% of Alaska's economy. Where is Alaska going to be? What's going to happen? The population is shrinking now for the first time in decades. So where do you see Alaska in the next 10, 20 years?
Wow, that's a tough question. I wish I had a really good and succinct answer. My crystal ball isn't quite clear enough to say exactly where Alaska will be 20 years from now. But here are a few assets that Alaska has that I think really bode well for its future, even though its future will probably look quite a bit different than its past. We do have a lot of natural resources that can benefit the planet beyond oil and gas. And, fishing has been, and I think will continue to be, an important part of its future, simply because, first of all, we have an abundance of fisheries resources, but secondly, because Alaska has really done a very good job of sustainably managing its fisheries. So, yes, there are ups and downs, but overall, high marks for the ability to manage this really abundant resource in a way that is sustainable. So I think that will still be there. We have water. How many places in the world 10 years from now will not have water? So for some of you who are really young, you won't remember this, but we once had a governor by the name of Wally Hickel who wanted to convert an oil tanker to become a water tanker and take fresh, clean water from Alaska and ship it down to California. Now, that seemed like a pretty crazy idea in 1990, and I'm not sure the economics work quite yet, but in comparison to desalination plants, I don't know. Maybe Alaska water actually will be an asset that will have enough value to be transportable. I don't know. We still have something that I think people value, and that is an extremely high quality of life, clean air, clean water, great hiking, amazing opportunities for recreation. So in an era where people can do a lot of their work any place, as long as they've got an internet connection. You know, I could imagine people getting sick of a 2-hour commute. Anybody in this room tired with a 2-hour commute? And wanting to live someplace where they can get on their bike in the morning or their skis in the morning and have clean air and clean water and go fishing in the afternoon and do their work anytime they want to. I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a replacement for oil and gas, but when I look out 20 years from now and ask myself, where are the places that really smart, creative, productive people are going to want to live and raise their families, I think Alaska actually ranks pretty doggone high. So, you know, is it going to look a lot different than it looks today? Yeah. Are we going to go through a period of time when our economy isn't so hot? Yeah. When we lose population? Yes. When it's a little painful to go through the process of actually imposing taxes? Because I know this will come as a shock to you in California, but in Alaska there is no statewide income tax and there is no statewide sales tax. So we're about to adopt some of those things, but probably because we won't be able to have the kind of oil revenues that have supported public services anymore. But you know, we'll go through some pain. And yes, it will be a different way of thinking about what our economy is all about. But I think Alaska stacks up pretty well. And oh, by the way, a lot of places in the world, I don't know exactly which ones, but the climate modelers can probably tell you more about this. Noah's in the back of the room. Noah can tell you. You know, there are going to be some places on this planet that are going to be so hot that you cannot live there anymore. And there are going to be places on this planet where you cannot grow food anymore because of both heat and lack of water. And, you know, you add all those things up and you say, 20 years is beyond what my crystal ball tells me, but I think Alaska is still going to be a pretty wonderful place to live.
Well, people are thinking of the next question. You know, we haven't talked about First Nations communities in Alaska, and it's one of the parts of the country where First Nations people are incredibly vibrant and really have a strong sense of ownership and a strong sense of engagement in the public enterprise. How has that changed the way Alaska works as a place, and how do you see it changing things in the future?
So Alaska has the largest percentage of indigenous people of any state in the nation. So Inupiat, Yupik, Athabaskan, Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian. We have many, many different Alaska Native peoples with their own language, their own cultures, their own histories, a lot of diversity. And what has happened in Alaska is really quite remarkable, because when I moved there in the 70s, there wasn't the kind of acceptance and pride of the indigenous culture that there is today. So we have gone from kind of a dark period when Alaska Natives couldn't even vote, right? And a sense of second-class citizens, to a place where they are respected in a way that really has continued on the upswing. And that is evidenced through the celebration of culture in many ways that people engage in now, but I would say with enthusiasm. And I'm an adopted Tlingit and feel very proud to have been embraced by and adopted by and encouraged to understand a culture that's quite different than a kid growing up in a small town in Wisconsin. So when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed in 1971, village and regional corporations were created instead of tribal reservations, as is done in the US. This is a whole nother hour lecture, which I won't give you, but those corporations today are pretty powerful economic engines. So they employ people both locally and outside of the state. They bring revenues back. They have businesses literally all over the world. They have taken advantage of things like the 8A priority, but they have also built on that, everything from construction companies to tourism companies to telecom businesses. So the Alaska Native culture has been on the rise, and the Alaska Native business has been on the rise. Not everyone is successful. Not everyone has what I would describe as the kind of engagement of their shareholders. If there was a representative of the Alaska Native people here, they would tell you that there have been ups and downs in that, and there have been winners and losers in that. But overall, looking back since 1971 when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed, it's a very positive story. And certainly in comparison to the reservation story of the lower 48. And I hope I have not insulted anyone in this room by saying that. I don't pretend to know everything that I should know about the reservation culture or the economy, but at a high level, I would say that the Alaska Native story is a very positive one. There was a question, was it Noah? Noah, go for it.
So,
and first of all, apologies for any of my overglassing of climate science.
No, it's fantastic.
You can correct me.
So my question is related to that and the kind of the potential future that you described in your answer about Alaska, and also your answer to Jim's question about the very optimistic, story that you told about the collective action response to the Arctic sea ice loss that provided a lot of hope for me. What lesson have you learned about collective action that the world should keep in mind in thinking about how to kind of meet the Paris goals, right? So the Paris goals are aspirational. There is a potential to avoid a lot of the climate outcomes that you described if those Paris goals are met, but we're not, the commitments don't meet the goals. Whether or not we're on track to even meet the commitments is another question. So what have you learned about that successful collective action that is a lesson for the world as we think globally about that challenge?
You have to make people care. Not about some abstract concept, but about something that is immediate and important to them. Their children, their grandchildren, their own health, their neighborhood, whether or not they're going to lose their house in a flood or a fire. I hate to personalize it quite that much. I'd like to think that people can be called to action on abstract things. Some people can be. But the collective action that is required to make the kind of massive shift in our society, in our economy, and global governance that is required to meet the scale of the problem that our world faces, I think boils down to communicating in a way that makes it so personal to people that they can't walk away from being part of the solution. Now, it's going to be different things for different people. There isn't just one thing. But I have become increasingly attracted to the message of climate change action in relationship to health. Because most people kind of get that if, let's take China as an example. I mean, I think a big part of why China is moving as progressively as it is in the climate action space is because if you cannot breathe, you sort of feel like you got to do something about it. And if your kids are getting sick and they're getting asthma and you have to walk around your streets with a mask on, and, you know, at some point that destabilizes your political world, right? So not only do you care about the fact that you're killing people by allowing pollution to continue, but you recognize at some point you're going to get a political revolution because people are dying, right? So that health aspect of climate action, in my opinion, is a big driver in China moving forward. And if there's a China expert in the room who would like to disagree with me, that's fair game, but that's my perception. So back to your question, collective action. There isn't just one thing, but personalizing this mission of change and finding a variety of different ways to do that. So if you are a farmer in Iowa and your crops can't grow as well because of a change in the climate, or because you don't have enough water, or because you've lost so much topsoil, I mean, connecting it in an economic way. For some people, it's a pocketbook issue as well. So what is our mission for those of us who care about this? I think it's trying all those different connection points and using a lot of different entities to do that. So one of the other hat, I wear a couple of hats in addition to the ones I'm wearing right now. I've been on the global board of the Nature Conservancy for about 6 years. The Nature Conservancy used to be pretty much all about saving special places. And it's moved toward climate change action because we've come to realize that all those special places that we've been saving for 60 years, you know, might not do so well if the climate changes as much as it's already changing, right? So we've tried to find different ways of working at the local level, at the community level, in other countries, in Africa, in South America, in China, at the level where you can get people to care. And so I think to the extent that there is an answer here, it's not just the science. It can't be. We've tried that. We've been doing the science for how long in the climate space? So it's got to be the science plus the connecting with people at a very human and personal level through communication, through action, through creating and showing paths towards success so people don't feel hopeless. Because if people feel hopeless, they just completely disengage and then we've lost the race. So giving people hope and finding really creative solutions that connect with what people care about. It's the best I can do. Microphone, who's got it? All right, Nona.
So the U.S. Arctic Research Commission...
I cannot hear you.
The U.S. Arctic Research Commission has played a really critical role in thinking about the future of the Arctic. But it also sounds like it's been a haven where President Obama's policies and perspectives and appointees really haven't been overturned. And so I guess my question is really about the future of the Arctic Research Commission, whether or not sort of what you see as your mission in working with the new administration, whether that you've had to engage in pushback, what's going to happen?
The U.S. Arctic Research Commission was created by Congress back in 1984 to provide advice to the federal agencies, to Congress, and to the President on prioritizing Arctic research agendas. We don't do research. We basically lay out, here are the big picture needs, and we work with something called the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, IARPC, which does a 5-year Arctic research plan for federal agencies. That IARPC was created by the same piece of legislation that created the Arctic Research Commission, and we're kind of joined at the hip. And France Cordova, as chair of the IARPC, is also on our board. So that's kind of the connection point there. So all of that has been unchanged by this administration. The Arctic Research Commissioners are appointed by the President. We serve specific terms, but we can be removed. We haven't been removed, same commission, same leadership mostly at NSF. The 5-year Arctic Research Plan was just re-blessed in December, so that's the same. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I can explain this, except it's moving forward. And the Arctic Science Ministerial, which, again, the last administration put in motion. This administration sees its value, and I will be one of the 3 delegates from the US to that Arctic Science Ministerial, along with France Cordova. So I think it's kind of like, it's not really interfering in a direct way with any of the high priority agenda items of this administration in a way that has either attracted attention or seems to be a problem. And to the extent that it continues this science diplomacy that I mentioned earlier in terms of the Arctic countries, that's perceived as a good thing. So that's like, you know, it's a different thing than the Paris Accord. It's a different thing than other international pronouncements. It's moving along in a way that I think is helpful. It hasn't really interfered, I guess, is about all I can say. So this whole process is just doing its work until it's told not to. Now, the extent to which any advice that the Commission might give, for example, in the space of climate action, I don't think that there are many people in the administration that necessarily are waiting for us to give them advice. But we are still giving advice in a variety of ways. And exactly what that may change or how that may look a year from now, I really can't predict for you. But because Congress created this, and because we still have an obligation to Congress and to the federal agencies, even if, you know, if it isn't as useful as it could be to secretaries of major departments, it's, I hope, still serving some sort of a general public purpose that is worthwhile for America.
Hi, I came in late, so apologize if this is already talked about. I'd be curious to know your opinion if you think Putin and Russia generally are possibly or probably pro climate change and global warming because it might have positive implications on their geopolitical status through trade and other economic ways.
Probably. So when you go to Arctic conferences and international events, which I've been to a few, the positions offered up by the Russian delegates at these events uniformly promote the Northern Sea Route as a very good thing, and of course promote their Yamal oil and gas development project as a very good thing. And, you know, they're very bullish on the future of the Arctic and have certainly invested in additional infrastructure. You know, they're building 3 new nuclear icebreakers, you know, more infrastructure along the shore, on and on and on. So it is in the Russian national interest to continue to move those things forward. It's where the money is, it's where the job opportunities are, it's where the international presence is, it's where their identity is. I mean, Russia identifies itself as an Arctic nation far more than the US thinks of itself as an Arctic nation. So all of those things sort of support this, yeah, it's not a bad thing, right? So I have heard Russian scientists both soft pedal the climate change, whether it's happening or not and at what pace, but I've also heard other Russian scientists who do a lot of monitoring and observing, talking about how much change they're observing. And in a non-judgmental way, simply saying, well, yes, of course it's happening, but it doesn't always have to be bad. I mean, there are always winners and losers in any change, right? So that's sort of a long answer, but yes, they see it as an opportunity zone. And so their attitude about it may be quite a bit different than other countries' attitude. Now, having said that, they're still going to have issues with their permafrost. So permafrost thaw was a contributing factor to the release of anthrax 2 years ago that killed a whole bunch of reindeer and made people sick. And so that was not a good thing. And so their infrastructure built on permafrost, they're going to have to adjust their construction techniques as well, because you can't ignore it, right? So they're going to have to do adaptation, whether they admit that publicly or not, but they're going to have to. And we have Russian permafrost scientists working with University of Alaska Fairbanks permafrost scientists all the time. And they're certainly not saying it's not happening, but the winners and losers thing makes it a much more complicated topic, unquestionably.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. I think we could probably take 2 quick questions.
Hello. You mentioned Kivalina being relocated earlier on, and I know Kivalina brought a lawsuit that wasn't successful, but several California jurisdictions and New York City have brought lawsuits, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on kind of science plus law and litigation as a way to move the ball on policy.
There's an old saying, bad facts make bad law. Good facts help you get to good law. So I would say I don't know the extent to which the cases in California and New York have good facts or bad facts to contribute to getting to a judgment that would be useful. Clearly in the Kivalina case, Kivalina, Nutak, Shishmaref, I mean, it's pretty obvious what is causing them to move. So that's sort of in the good facts case. But you still have the problem of cause and effect and accountability and responsibility. And the extent to which the oil industry makes the case that they are providing a substance that fuels the economy and that is demanded by consumers, people who drive cars, businesses, utilities that generate electricity, et cetera, there's the fault question. And I haven't looked at those cases, so I really can't opine on the ability to move that fault issue, plus the facts, plus the existing statutory language, plus, I don't know the answer to whether or not they're likely to succeed or fail. But personally, I don't think litigation is the answer. In this space, it's much bigger than a particular lawsuit and being able to get damages from Exxon or from any other oil industry. What we really need is a whole shift, right, of our economy, of our culture, of how we generate power, of how we transport people, of what foods we eat, how we grow, our whole agricultural regime, which is not particularly climate friendly. I mean, there is so much more than just, pinning the donkey's tail on Exxon. It's much bigger than that. So is it a piece of increasing awareness and getting more coverage so people actually think about whose fault is it? And maybe it's our fault, all of our fault, not just one company or one industry or... Anyway, I don't have a really good answer for you, except I think our problem is way bigger than can be solved by a lawsuit.
Anybody wants to ask one last question?
Okay, so here's into question. So I'm going to give you one last plea, which is don't check out. Don't give up. Don't have this sense that this problem is way too big. I can't fix it. Of course you can't fix it. But I will submit to you that the only way it's going to get fixed is if a whole lot of people do a whole lot of work in whatever space you're in. And that may be as a scientist, it may be as a communicator, it may be as a politician, it may be as a business owner, it may be as an investor, it may be in lots of different ways, but it is a fabulous opportunity to live on a planet like Earth that has the kind of amazing characteristics of just mostly all the things we need to live, and the fact that we as a human species are busily destroying a lot of the things that make this really the only planet that we know of in the solar system or beyond that is okay for human beings. Personally, I think this idea of going to Mars and trying to create a new place to live is nuts. I would much prefer that the intellectual energy and resources and funding that's going into that project would go into keeping our planet alive. And we have the power to do that by a combination of science and research and engineering and technology and lifestyle changes and policy and investment and creativity and the sheer force of will. We have overcome some amazing things, we, the human species. And so I would just beg of you, don't give up and find a way that you can help make a difference. Thank you.
You know, before we started, Fran mentioned that she was a little nervous about not being able to show all her beautiful photographs of the Arctic. And I think you would agree with me that we've seen a picture of the Arctic that's unusual and difficult to see through any other mechanism. So I want to thank Fran again personally, and you guys can clap again if you want, but you don't have to. But I do want to invite all of you to continue this conversation, take up the challenge that Fran offered, and if you want to stay around now and continue the conversation and have a snack, you're more than welcome to do that. So thanks again for joining us for this environmental conversation.